welcome to the Irish Tech News podcast. I'm your guest host, Ian MacRae. I'm a psychologist and author of 6 work psychology books, including Dark Social, Understanding the Darker Side of Work, Personality, and Social Media. I've put together a 5-part mini-series on brains, communication, and digital behavior. I'm going to talk with 5 really interesting guests about mindset, brain health, psychological education on social media, algorithms and dating apps, and how Web3 and cryptocurrency communities form. My 4th guest is Dr. Aaron Brace. Aaron is the co-founder of ad tech startup TACTech, the first platform of its kind to enable advertisers to automate AI-driven audience testing and deploy ads across multiple ad networks simultaneously. Prior to this, he spent 3 years at Facebook in Dublin and many more as a data scientist in the media industry. Aaron has a PhD in psychology from the University of Sussex. We're going to talk about how algorithms affect communication and social connections online, with a focus on algorithms in online dating. Well, hi, Aaron. Thanks for coming on the Irish Tech News podcast. I'm really excited to talk to you today because I've had a series of interviews with neuroscientists and psychologists, and I'm really fascinated by algorithms and how they affect our relationships, especially online. So I know you have a lot of experience with this, and I hope you can explain a bit about how they work. Like, how are algorithms affecting our lives or our relationships? Where are they? And why are they important? Why are they kind of changing how we relate to each other, communicate with each other?
Oh, my pleasure, Ian. Thanks for having me on. In terms of algorithms themselves, I think the most common place we're finding them, certainly in this era, is social media. There's been a huge amount of controversy. We talk about films like the Social Dilemma, for example, about how algorithms might shape the way we interact with people for better or worse. I think there's probably been some slight misconceptions about that. But in terms of what they are and how they might work on social media themselves, they're not particularly open source a lot of the time. They're either patented, in which case they are open source, but they're probably wrapped in quite a lot of technical detail that's difficult to access, or more commonly, they're kind of protected, like KFC's kind of secret spice recipe, if you like. No one quite knows what that is.
Okay, yeah, so they're kind of everywhere, but I think one of the things that people may not understand so much about algorithms, especially after watching something like The Social Dilemma, is they're actually really useful, right? There's a lot of content on the internet, and we aren't really capable of processing all that information, understanding it all. So they're a way of filtering out information that is going to be hopefully useful or relevant to us, right? Like just showing us information from our friends who we interact with the most, or how are the algorithms filtering out information that it thinks we're going to be interested in? What kind of stuff is it showing to us?
Yeah, of course. So I guess the most famous of these is Facebook's feed algorithm. That's something they're really secretive about. I think more than probably anything at Facebook's, how the feed works is kind of very shrouded. The misconception about feed is that people feel that it's designed to keep you on platform as long as possible, or designed to somehow make you quote unquote addicted to the platform, but that's not necessarily the case. So for Twitter and Facebook specifically, there's definitely been a move away from goaling towards keeping people on site. We're not entirely sure what these algorithms do in terms of the feed and what they're trying to present, but what we can learn from them is what the goal of the platforms and the feed themselves are purported to achieve. So as we said, they've moved away quite heavily from goaling towards just keeping people on site, and starting to goal more towards things like Facebook, for example, are called meaningful social interactions. Now, it's kind of up for debate exactly what a meaningful social interaction is, of course. And Twitter talk about meaningful engagement. And again, those things are up for debate exactly, depending on which side of the line you sit on what meaningful is. But understanding that these algorithms and the presentation of content on these sites is geared towards things that those platforms think would be interesting and engaging to you, and not just keeping people around, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that does make sense. I mean, the question about meaningful interaction is always an interesting one, especially when we can't see what the algorithms are actually doing, right? Unless we have open source algorithms, we can only kind of guess from the effects they have. Like I notice sometimes on LinkedIn or something, they'll clearly have changed something because all of a sudden people are doing something very differently, right? Like they've just added polls and now everyone is going crazy for, this feature or that feature. So we can only work backwards. There's a whole marketing industry on trying to figure out what that is, right? Do you think it's good that they're closed source? Do you think it would be better if they were open source, or would that just kind of make the whole thing more open to manipulation by people who are trying to game the system?
Well, I think Twitter, for example, have recently allowed you to switch off their feed ranking algorithm and just
Mm.
allow recency. So things that are most recent in your Twitter feed be the things that show up first. It's debatable whether that creates a nicer experience. It probably creates a more transparent experience because
Mm.
you're not having things promoted to you on their guess of what is relevant to you based on your graph, but things that are kind of more pertinent in the moment. Um, Facebook, on the other hand, I don't believe that feature's currently available.
No,
Um,
there was one on Facebook for a while where you could just have it chronologically ordered, and it was. I remember seeing that, and it was an absolute mess. It was terrifying. It was
I'm,
unmanageable.
I'm sure they do work really hard in terms of that. Facebook are very explicit about down ranking content that tries to game the system. So
Mm.
things like clickbaity headlines or stuff that um, is designed purely to get people to react to it, whether that's inflammatory content or just really pure clickbait. They do attempt to downrank that. Again, how they downrank that and how successful that is up for debate. But in terms of gaming it and not going towards a recency feed, I think that's their attempt to try and keep things as relevant as possible without it being um, gamed by bad actors, if you like.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, I've talked to a lot of people in marketing or communications who have said if you're trying to manage these social media platforms, don't try and game the system too much. Don't try and get fake views or don't try and, use manipulative techniques because that always ends up failing in the long term because the platforms and their algorithms can usually keep up with that faster than most other people can. But moving on from social media platforms, I think some people will use those platforms for dating. But one of the areas that I've looked into less and have less knowledge of is algorithms in dating. Like I'm really interested in professional relationships and how like professional networks look online. Dating, I don't actually have that much idea about. So how do those algorithms work on dating platforms? Are they a similar type of thing? Are they fundamentally different? Do we even know what's going on behind the scenes on dating platforms?
Well, I think sometimes we do and sometimes we don't with dating platforms, and they're changing all the time to try and make things a little bit more transparent. But one thing we can be pretty sure of in a lot of these platforms, not all of them, is an algorithm called or a technique known as collaborative filtering. So this is the idea that say for example Netflix and recommendation. Say that you watched, Breaking Bad, Stranger Things, and Game of Thrones. I don't even know if Game of Thrones is on Netflix, to be honest. That's how poor I was in those examples. But
I know
say,
what you mean, though. Yeah, certain type
say
of
what,
profile for people watching certain types of things.
yeah, exactly. Say you watch those three things and you gave your rating for those three things. You gave, 1 of 6, 1 of 10, and 1 of 5. What collaborative filtering attempts to do is say, okay, of the people like you, so people that rated those things in that way, what are other things that those people liked and therefore get recommended to you?
Yeah, so you're kind of taking what people's interests are and try to match people, but you're trying to match like for like people, right? People who like similar things, have similar interests, do similar types of activities, trying to put them together.
Exactly. So, for example, people that look like you in a dating sense and match with certain people that you've matched with based on the characteristics that they've got of those people. Again, what they use specifically to unpick what a person's characteristics are in a dating app is up for debate. But based on those, what are people that look like you in a behavioural sense? Who do they tend to match with? And we can
Okay.
be sure that that kind of recommendation is certainly happening.
And does it work? Does that kind of recommendation pairing work? Is that the same way people, choose dates, relationship partners in the real world?
Well, that's a difficult thing. I think that's the one thing we don't really know. We know that, for example, if we're talking about what a successful relationship in the real world would look like, people tend to suggest that marriage, a long-term partner, would be a good life goal for someone when going on a dating app. Um,
Yeah,
People
that's
that
the goal
meet
of a
on
lot of
dating,
people.
yeah, I think it would make sense. That's kind of what you would. I think I think around 60% of people using dating apps suggest that a long-term relationship is what they're looking for. Um, but people that meet on dating apps tend to divorce at a far higher rate than people that met elsewhere.
Hmm.
So, in terms of whether those recommendations actually work for long-term success, I think the jury's probably slightly out on that.
Okay, and it kind of depends on people being kind of honest and having realistic representations of their behavior on the apps too. Are people generally honest on the apps? Are they kind of telling fibs? Because if you're lying to the algorithm, then it's going to be giving you results based on that data, right? Does that have an impact, do you think?
I think so. Maybe not even just lying. So lying is one thing. I think there's some data that suggests over 50% of people claim that they lie, whether that's exaggerating certain traits. I'm
Yeah.
sure possibly be the same in real life. To some extent, people exaggerate when they're dating, but also is trying to potentially rationalize a process that's very emotional.
Mm.
So we don't really know very well how much the partners that people say they want typically end up being the partners that they marry in real life. I don't think there's a huge amount of data on that, which would be interesting. Whereas in online dating, you're kind of filtering people in a rational way up front. You're filtering them from a lot of information that you wouldn't normally have when you met people in real life without the dating app. So if you met someone at work, in a bar, you wouldn't have things like political views, which are often posted directly on there. You wouldn't have these 5 photos in different contextual locations to make judgments on. And I think one thing we really aren't aware of is how much that additional information that's been chosen by the user to upload their profile and paint a picture of themselves is actually effective in how we filter people on the app versus not having that information, how we would select someone to date in a non-dating app context.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point that you make, actually, that there's not a lot of good research on this, and all of the algorithms there are mostly closed source too, right? So we don't necessarily know how they're working or if they are actually working really well, because we can't really look into that and see how they're different or whether it's necessarily a better system.
Yeah.
Do you think, I mean, what kind of outcomes would research look at or should research look at? Like, what's a good outcome in the sense of dating? Obviously, a lot of people are looking for long term relationships or marriage, but is there any other kind of qualities or attributes that you can measure that would make a successful, I don't know, dating profile or dating match or dating outcome?
Yeah, so Hinge, for example, I think they're a newer, more trendier kind of dating app. I've been in a relationship for 7 or 8 years. I've kind of missed the boat on actually using these things. But friends have told me that Hinge is a kind of the kind of, I don't want to say leader in this, but that they've been very open about the kind of algorithms they use. So they use something known as the Gale Shapley algorithm. So it's a Nobel Prize winning algorithm that was meant to optimize pairing the two traders of commodities, so non-financial commodities, things like pairing two people that want to trade, have organ donation services. You can't buy an organ, but maybe if you have two different people looking to trade, you can match that, for example. Um, so they've been honest to say, okay, how can we pair people using this algorithm? So their approach on it is, we're not just going to match people based on the things they like. We're going to match people based on things they like, the people they match with, and the behaviours with those people. So they know, for example, the matches you have, the kind of conversations you have, maybe not the actual text conversation itself, but certainly the length of conversation, whether you go on to meet that person. So they understand what a good conversation looks like in terms of length, in terms of the communication style, presumably, and they know if you go on to meet that person. So it's not just matching people based on interest, it's matching people in the knowledge of what a good, at least early stage dating looks like, which comes back to your point of how does online dating manage best case outcomes.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I mean that's interesting too. I mean it's interesting that they're using a kind of commodities trading algorithm, but also that they've got an interesting amount of behavioral data. So it's not just about people listing their preferences or likes or dislikes. It's also there are some outcomes in there that they can measure. I mean whether or not you can successfully measure those in the long term or what people are looking for is consistent with that is a tough question, isn't it? But like how does that decision making process work? Because obviously there's a lot of different information that you're getting online versus offline, what people choose to present. Especially online in a profile tends to be really, really specific. Like if you've got, I don't know how many characters you've got, but if you can only put a very small amount of information on, like what information are you putting on to encourage people or deter others to connect with you? Like how does that work with choosing people who you want to match with or would actually go from matching with to meeting in the real world?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, part of the issue is that each one of these apps tend to offer different options to how much information you can provide, how many images you can provide,
Mm.
and different prompts that you can fill out in response to their kind of interesting questions. So if you look at, say, for example, Tinder, you really get selection of images and free text. Very little structure in terms of what you're prompted to write. Whereas Hinge, for example, I believe you're prompted with certain questions. Don't match with me if, and then you can prompt something.
Okay.
Normally it's typically funny, or
Yeah.
we will get along if X, Y, and Z. My most interesting characteristic is. Um, so one thing I don't think that's been researched particularly effectively is how well these apps um, differently affect outcomes. So, is someone on Tinder more likely to have better relationship success than someone on Hinge? Is there a self-selection bias there? Whereas people that go on Tinder are looking for a different type of relationship to those that go on Hinge, for example. Um, so in terms of processing information, we've not only got the issue like that you suggested just then, we've got this information processing issue where we've got a lot of information. We don't know particularly well which attributes we're going to make pertinent in our decision, but we've also got different information on different apps to try and encounter
Okay.
this.
And so, I mean, the question a lot of people would have is which one's the best one or which one has the best outcomes. But really, we don't know that, right? Like, you kind of have to go on yourself and see what information fits what you want to be sharing or who you want to be meeting with. Because there's probably different cultures on those apps depending on what kind of information they're putting, right? Like, some are probably more conducive to, let's say, long versus short term relationships.
Yeah, so and there's also kind of identity group based apps as well. I know a couple of married, two kids that met on JSwipe, which I think is specifically Jewish people
Oh,
looking for
okay.
other Jewish people dating, which is slightly not really in the sphere of the kind of fast social dating apps that we're talking about around
Yeah.
Tinder and Hinge. But you also got kind of the old style, Match.com, which seems to have been forgotten these days, but they proclaim to have a very successful um, matching record. How much of that is PR versus not, I'm not sure, but there's certainly some work to be done in terms of identity based
Yeah.
dating. The identity based dating thing is interesting as well, like whether you would in real life opt for someone of a chosen identity versus pre-filtering those out at the beginning. That's a very interesting question.
Yeah, I imagine some of that would happen to a certain degree. Like, most people have red lines in relationships or certain types of people they prefer to match with. But yeah, it's interesting when you have a really, really narrow set of information that's mostly picture and text based instead of having, visual clues and context and environmental clues. Like, you learn a lot about someone about, when you're in an actual real world environment with them, seeing how they talk with you, what kind of stuff they bring up in an unstructured environment, if you're arranging a date, what kind of places they want to go to, all of that stuff, which isn't really information that's available online necessarily in the same way. But still, you've got so much other information because you've got different algorithms, you've got different profiles, you could potentially be on multiple dating apps. So, with all of those people on all of those apps, all trying to find matches, how do you manage that level of information? Is that useful? Is it helpful? Are people capable of managing that much information?
I think that's a really, really tricky question, Ian. To be honest, I think what ends up happening, and we see some research on that, is a kind of energy drain. With that much information, people find it very difficult to kind of stay on target about the things that they're attempting to filter for. So some research has suggested that eventually, overuse of these apps can lead to a kind of gamification. People going on there for the fun of using the apps and trying to gamify their filtration process rather than go there for the original goal, which is seeking a relationship. That kind of information can be, um, analysis by or paralysis by analysis to some extent, you could say.
Yeah. I wonder if that's where some of those biases come in too, or why there's some of that simplification and kind of removing political groups from consideration is just because there's so much information, so many options. How do you narrow down that potential dating pool or make choices? Like, I think people probably just have to try and figure out ways to make shortcuts, even if they're not necessarily the most constructive or effective shortcuts that you make to filter out people who, may have a lot of other things in common with, may form good relationships if you met in the real world, but there's just the scale of information makes it impossible to try and have a meaningful connection with every single person you're kind of scrolling through or might want to
Absolutely.
interact with.
Absolutely. I think that's kind of for me, it's the most interesting one is the political preferences question. For example, there are a few interesting articles in the UK where people talking about the I would never date a Tory is a
Yeah.
typical one that comes up, and so filtering them out on the dating app. But there's also research suggesting that couples with, or famous couples specifically with differing political views, can get on and have long, successful marriages in the real world. So whether filtering that kind of thing out in the app reflects how we would filter out that kind of thing in the real world, it's probably up for debate. I think to some extent there are things that people believe is a strong preference for them. That if you were to meet someone in real life and engage with them, that would become less of a red line. I'm sure the political thing for many people is a big red line, but not for everyone, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I wonder if just the general kind of social discourse around politics is kind of creating more problems in that area, just because there's language that people are really used to dividing and filtering based on, but it's not necessarily always productive language for just meeting another random person on the street or in your neighborhood or whatever. It's very kind of politically heated, charged, emotionally charged debates that happen over here, but aren't necessarily always the best way to talk to people one to one in a bar or just someone you're meeting. So I wonder if it would be better if people used less of that explicitly political language to talk about preferences. I mean, obviously, people will have ideological differences, and in a relationship, if you have different attitudes to something like birth control, that's going to be a fundamental issue in a relationship. But whether or not you voted for one party or another is probably not the most kind of, probably the best predictor of whether people are going to have good long-term relationships or can have a healthy discussion and kind of healthy relationships.
No, and you can make a case that is a quite a negative feedback loop. If people are constantly filtering out people with political views that they disagree with, then there's far less chance of kind of societal discourse. There's less chance of those kind of meaningful interactions across party lines happening to some extent. If someone will never date someone of X political orientation, then there's less chance of just general discussion about those things between two different viewpoints.
Yeah, and it makes it, I think, more difficult if those barriers go up everywhere in every single app, in every single platform, instead of keeping it more constrained to the kind of just political sphere for a certain kind of certain types of event, or there's certain occasions where discussing politics may be more accepted, and some places where it may not be necessary. And dating apps, depending on your beliefs, may not be the best place for that sometimes. But again, that goes back to good outcomes, right? Like, what kind of good outcomes can we see in dating? Can people of different backgrounds, ideologies, political beliefs have good relationships? But there's kind of a disposability in that, right? Like, if someone says one thing wrong, someone says one thing you disagree with, automatically discard the whole person instead of agreeing to disagree on that idea. Does that have an impact on people's relationship quality, or who they're meeting, or challenges in kind of having successful relationships and dating?
Yeah, no, you're right. I think the disposability element is really interesting. There's been a lot of research starting to emerge in that area. There's a sociologist by the name of Jen Gonzalez who's working really intensely in that area, specifically around how do we manage this concept of disposability. For the first time, um, probably in human history to some extent, there is just a ready pipeline of willing daters, next person up. So when there is that situation where someone's dating and they have 5 or 6 or 7 other people chatting on the apps, it makes the current situation a little bit more fragile, in the sense that if things don't work out, or there's some minor thing you don't like about a person, and everyone has flaws and all relationships have flaws, and they're very difficult to work at. But if that's the case, they're disposable. We can move on. Let's see if the next person's perfect. I think that is certainly something that needs more research, although there's emerging in that area, about how we kind of approach current dating, in online dating, giving people a chance and giving ourselves a chance without just relying on this pipeline of people.
Yeah, I mean, that raises a couple interesting points, and one is about how like people individually, personally are approaching the apps, and if there's any skills or ideas that people need to bring into dating apps. Like, how quick should you come to judgments about certain people? What kind of questions should you ask, instead of necessarily automatically rejecting people for what might be seen as a minor reason to other people? And just kind of how you're reflecting on how you're using the app. I think that's generally pretty good advice for any social media platform, is really understanding what you're going in for it for, what kind of compromises you're willing to make, what you absolutely don't want to make. That's good to know too. But being able to reflect on the process and not just getting caught up in the constant kind of swiping and impulsive nature of it, but having some time to reflect and think about what you're doing. But the other thing you said about that constant pipeline is interesting because that's very much a city thing, right? So if you're surrounded by 7 million people in London, there definitely is a constant pipeline, not just because there's more people than you will ever be able to meet in your lifetime, but also because there's constantly a lot of people moving in and out and a lot of mobility in and out of cities. Whereas if you're not in a city, there's probably a lot less of a pipeline and a lot fewer people around. So yeah, there can be much less of a pipeline there if you're in a more rural community, remote environment, smaller town. Then the dating pool tends to be much smaller. So I think we've talked about some of the limitations of online dating, but for a lot of people, it does that kind of openness and access to a larger pool of dating options, a larger group of people can be really, really useful. And you might actually meet people who you never would have seen before, or you never would have met if you were only looking for people in the same town at the same couple of bars or, restaurants or wherever you would normally go, social clubs, wherever you would spend your time. So there's some really useful elements there too that we don't necessarily always consider if we're thinking about, being in a city or being in a really high concentration of people versus in a more remote community.
No, absolutely, and I think when we criticise some elements of online dating, and throughout this conversation, we've kind of um, had the premise that without online dating, there would be a relationship that's formed from another context. Where, of course, that's not always the case. Without online dating, that might mean that a certain person would not have formed a relationship at all. So, in that instance, online dating is a route where a relationship can be formed where there would otherwise be none, or be more difficult, like you say, in rural settings, remote living. So in that sense, there is absolutely room for praise in that sense.
Yeah, and in some cases, there's probably a lot to be said for that filtration process too, because there's probably people with very undesirable behaviors that you can avoid meeting if it might be a kind of realistic, like actually dangerous or really aggressive situation. Like there's definitely people you see even on social media platforms where you're like, okay, that is a person whose behavior I would never want to sit in the same room with. Or this is kind of their kind of approach to dating or relating to other people that is absolutely not the kind of person I would want to see. So there's like, I think some of that filtration process could be useful, especially if you're worried about kind of just the safety of meeting random people, or you're worried about or concerned about exactly who you want to meet and in what environment. There's a lot of stuff that you can set up ahead of time. I mean, there's probably a lot of advice there on the internet about how to go about setting up meetings and meeting people in person versus offline. But it's really useful in that sense, right? Like that kind of filtration can be really, really good for people if it's used in a kind of productive and ethical way.
Yeah, certainly. I think it's very, very easy to criticise anything that's kind of a technological advancement in something that is seemingly very human. It's very easy to criticise the encroachment of technology. But we're not necessarily saying that. What we're trying to suggest is that that filtration process, like you say, is very useful. It does help you narrow down some preferences that you're interested in, and behaviours and people that might be useful in a dating sense. But what we don't quite capture very well is how much that, or how that differently that is reflected to by your normal behaviour without dating apps, and how much that filtration process that you're applying is reflective of how you would normally filter dating. So different. We don't know if worse or better. Some, it could go either way potentially, but it's not automatically worse. I think is
Yeah,
my
and I
takeaway.
mean, half of people are using them, and that number has been growing pretty much every year. So obviously, they are very useful for a lot of people. So because people aren't abandoning them in droves, so they must be providing some value, and people are, getting married based on people they meet on dating apps. They're having successful relationships. Not everyone is, but it definitely needs more investigation. It needs more reflection, and like you said, we don't really know about the outcomes. So more research really needs to be done in this area, and I kind of wish there was. But I'm excited to see what the results are when it comes out.
Right, so what's very interesting is that Hinge, especially since the start of lockdown, I guess more uh, through necessity than intention from the start, is they're moving slightly into the video dating space. So previously we talked about filtration and trying to rationalise something very human. I wonder if a movement towards online video dating could kind of bridge the gap there. It can, we can still have our preferences and our online filtration process, but you also have this human connection element to work with, that kind of information that you wouldn't get purely from chatting on the app and looking at profiles. I think that could be a really smart way of kind of helping us link those preferences we have and the filtration process we have online with the kind of process we'd have when we actually talk to people face to face, even though it's digitally face to face.
Okay, yeah, so that's good to see. At least there's developments, there's different types of communication coming down the pipeline there, and dating apps too. I can see how video messaging would be really interesting. I can also see probably all of the problems that it will lead to, so hopefully they have decent moderation on there, because you can see what will happen with that. Yeah, but it's a really interesting area of research, and it's funny to see how all of the developments in tech are moving, not just in social media, but to pretty much every sphere, and dating is definitely one of them. So I think we'll probably continue to see a lot of changes in this area, and I'm interested to see what comes. So thank you very much for talking to me today. Really interesting discussion. I think a lot of people will find this quite useful. Whether or not it's kind of interesting, it might also be practical. So some kind of tips and things that people can learn about online dating or knowing about how others use it. So thanks very much.
Appreciate having me in.
Yeah, cheers.